right, so today we're going to look into this whole thing going on in Guyana. This cash grant they're proposing. It's really causing a lot of buzz. Basically, the government is planning to give like 100,000 Guyanese dollars to every single citizen, to help with the cost of living going up and up. I mean, on the surface, that sounds like a pretty sweet deal, right?
Yeah, $100,000.
I mean, who wouldn't want that?
Yeah.
But, looking into these articles you sent me, it's clear that there's a lot more to this story. There's a lot going on beneath the surface.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's interesting how this whole cash grant thing has become such a hot button issue.
Mm-hmm.
To really understand, what's going on, we need to look at the bigger picture, the economic situation in Guyana. Inflation's been hitting people pretty hard.
Yeah.
Cost of living has just become a major concern.
Right, and that's where the government is saying this grant comes in. It's a way to help people who are struggling, give them some relief, But some people aren't so convinced.
Yeah, there's definitely a good deal of skepticism, especially from the opposition. Aubrey Norton, the opposition leader, has been very vocal. He's calling for special scrutineers to be part of the whole distribution process.
So what is a scrutineer exactly, and why is Norton so insistent on having them involved?
Well, basically, a scrutineer is like an independent observer. They monitor the process to make sure everything's above board, fair and transparent.
Norton's concern is that without these scrutineers, there's a much higher risk of corruption. He's worried the money might not actually end up in the hands of the people who need it most.
And, I mean, this isn't the first time that there have been concerns about corruption in Guyana, right?
Unfortunately, no. Guyana has a history of this sort of thing, allegations of corruption, which really just adds another layer of complexity to this whole cash grant situation. I mean, it's understandable why people would be wary.
Especially with the amount of money we're talking about here. I mean, this is billions of dollars.
Yeah.
Exactly, billions with a B. And that kind of leads to another sticking point, this whole thing about including non-resident Guyanese in the program.
Right. This is where things get really interesting. The Vice President, Farat Jagdeo, has said that non-resident Guyanese will also be eligible for the $100,000. And this has really sparked a lot of debate about, what the government's priorities really are.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the key question here. The initial reason for this whole cash grant was to help the people living in Guyana, the ones dealing with this high cost of living every day. So it makes you wonder, why extend this benefit to people living abroad? They're not facing the same pressures, are they?
That's a good question. And the opposition leader definitely didn't hold back. I mean, in one of the articles you sent, Norton actually questions the government's logic directly. He points out, and I quote, "How is it you had no money to pay a little below 15,000 teachers, but you are finding money to pay thousands of Guyanese in the diaspora?"
Wow, that's a pretty powerful statement. It really gets to the heart of the matter. That the government has resisted increasing teacher salaries, saying they just don't have the money. And now, all of a sudden, they have billions for this cash grant. And like Norton said, it includes people who aren't even living in Guyana, dealing with the cost of living there.
Right. So on one hand, they're saying this grant is to help with costs, but then on the other hand, their actions seem to say something else entirely.
It's definitely a mixed message.
Very confusing.
Yeah, it really raises questions about what the government's true intentions are.
Mm.
And how they decide where to spend money, especially when you think about all the corruption allegations in the past.
So how is the average Guyanese citizen reacting to all of this? The ones caught in the middle of all this.
It's kind of a mixed bag. Some people are excited, obviously, about getting extra money, especially with things being so expensive. But there are also a lot of people who are worried, about the possibility of corruption.
Yeah.
And the lack of transparency around the program.
So this cash grant, well, maybe being beneficial in some ways, it seems like it's also exposed some deeper issues within Guyana's political and economic systems.
It shows the challenges they face with transparency and accountability in how the government spends money. And it started important conversations about how to deal with this cost of living problem.
And this is where it gets even more complex. The decision to give money to non-resident Guyanese, that's really just fueled the fire.
Right. It's adding fuel to the fire when it comes to those concerns. About fairness and transparency. I mean, it raises so many questions, like what are the rules even going to be for non-resident Guyanese? How do they decide who gets the money? And how will the government make sure that the money actually gets to the people who need it, both in Guyana and abroad?
Right. And in the end, who benefits the most from all of this? Is it really about helping everyday Guyanese citizens, or is there something else going on?
Those are the million-dollar questions. And it's important for us to really break this all down so that people
Yeah.
can understand what's really happening here, the full scope of this whole situation.
Definitely.
There's a lot to unpack.
It's amazing how this whole thing, giving out money, it seems so simple on the surface. But it's really sparked this huge debate about all sorts of things. Governance and public trust. Really makes you think.
It really does. Like, what would be a better way to help people in Guyana? With the cost of living, I mean. Are there any alternatives to this whole cash grant idea?
Well, there are a few options the government could consider. Instead of just handing out cash, one thing they could do is focus on targeted subsidies for essential things, like basic food staples, rice, flour, cooking oil, that sort of thing. That way the help goes directly to the people who need it most.
That makes a lot of sense. It seems a lot more practical, really. No chance of this kind of controversy.
Exactly. And another option would be to put more money into social safety net programs, the kind of programs that provide ongoing support to the most vulnerable people. So things like unemployment benefits, food assistance, affordable housing.
Exactly. So instead of just a one-time payment,
Yeah,
you have these programs that offer a more sustainable safety net.
I see. For people who are really struggling to get by.
Right. And of course, you can't forget about the root causes of inflation, dealing with things like supply chain issues, increasing how much is produced domestically, promoting economic diversification.
Right. It's not a simple fix. It's going to take a multifaceted approach to really tackle this problem. But going back to the cash grant for a second, you know what Norton said about teacher salaries? That really stuck with me.
Yeah.
It kind of shows how frustrated people are, especially public sector workers.
Oh, absolutely. Teachers are so vital to society, and they deserve to be paid fairly for the work they do. But the government's saying they can't afford to give them a decent raise, but then they turn around and find billions for this cash grant, which, like we said, includes people not even living in Guyana. It's a hard thing to swallow for a lot of people.
It really makes you wonder about their priorities. And what about the average Guyanese citizen? How do you think all of this is impacting their trust in the government?
Well, trust is a fragile thing, especially when it comes to the government. When there's a lack of transparency and accountability, people lose trust. And when big decisions like this, cash grant, are made without a clear explanation or without talking to the people it affects, it just makes things worse.
So this whole controversy, it's really shown how important transparency is and accountability in government. It's not just about the money. It's about making sure things are done fairly and that people have a say.
Exactly. And this isn't just a Guyana thing. This is a global issue. People all over the world want more transparency from their leaders. They want to know how their taxes are being spent and how decisions are made that affect their lives.
So where do we go from here? What can be done to address this lack of transparency and rebuild trust in the government?
Well, one thing is to strengthen oversight, set up independent bodies, to keep an eye on government spending, conduct audits, investigate any allegations of corruption. And it's crucial to give power to civil society organizations and the media to act as watchdogs, holding the government accountable.
So it sounds like it's going to take a joint effort from both the government and the citizens
Exactly.
to make things more transparent.
And build a system where people are held accountable.
Now let's talk about this whole thing with non-resident Guyanese. What are the potential implications of including them in this program, both good and bad?
Well, that's an interesting question. On the one hand, including the diaspora, those living abroad, it could be seen as a nice gesture, recognizing their connection to Guyana and their potential to contribute to the country.
Right, especially for those who still feel close to Guyana.
Exactly. And you could argue that they already contribute through things like sending money back home or investing in businesses. But on the other hand, there are some real downsides to consider. Well, there's the issue of fairness. We talked about that earlier. The main goal is to help people in Guyana who are dealing with the high cost of living. So giving money to people who aren't living there, who aren't facing the same struggles, doesn't seem very fair, does it?
It does seem to go against what the government said they were trying to do.
Right. And then there's the potential for abuse. Without clear rules about who's eligible and wings to verify everything, there's a real risk that the money could be misused or end up in the wrong hands.
And that would just make people trust the program even less.
Exactly, both in Guyana and among the diaspora.
It's a tricky situation.
Definitely a lot of layers to this.
It seems like this whole cash grant thing has really opened up a can of worms. Questions about the economy, government transparency, and the role of the diaspora.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex issue with a lot of different angles.
This deep dive has given me so much to think about. It's fascinating how something like this, a cash grant, can reveal so much about how a country works and the political landscape.
What I find really interesting is how it started this debate about what it actually means to be Guyanese.
Sure.
Is it just about living there? Or is there something more, a connection that goes beyond just geography?
That's a really deep question, and it's something a lot of countries are dealing with, especially those with large diasporas. How do you balance the needs of citizens living abroad with those who are living in the country?
It's a tough one. No easy answers. But it's a conversation that needs to happen, especially as the world becomes more and more interconnected.
So to sum things up for our listeners, we've taken a deep dive into this proposed cash grant in Guyana. We've looked at the economic situation, the heated political debate, the potential pros and cons, and the concerns about how it will actually be implemented.
We've also talked about the arguments for and against including non-resident Guyanese, and looked at the history of corruption allegations and what this all means for governance and public trust.
But like with any complex issue, there's always more to uncover. We've given you a framework, a starting point for your own exploration.
Exactly. It's up to each individual to form their own opinion, based on the information we've discussed. Weigh the different perspectives, and think critically about the potential consequences.
So if you were a citizen of Guyana, how would you feel about all of this? Would you be happy about the extra cash? Or would you be more worried about the lack of transparency and fairness?
There's no right or wrong answer. It's a personal decision.
This deep dive has been quite a journey into a complex issue with no easy solutions.
Definitely.
We've explored economics, politics, ethics.
But most importantly, we've encouraged you to think critically, to question assumptions, consider different viewpoints, and engage in meaningful dialogue.
So as we wrap things up, we want to leave you with one final thought. What does this whole cash grant controversy tell us about the challenges and opportunities facing Guyana as it moves forward on its path towards economic development and social progress?
Hate asking those tough questions. Stay informed and make your voice heard. Because the future of Guyana, like any nation, depends on the active engagement of its citizens.
Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.